Very good afternoon, friends.
We can start, Doctor.
I welcome you all to the uh, second webinar series done by the Clinical Infectious Disease Society, SIDS on COVID. And this will be the last session for this second webinar series. And it's a kind of an open session. The session is titled Ask Us Anything. So you could ask us anything regarding COVID, of course. And we have an eminent list of panelists. And to moderate the session, we have Dr. Ashwini Tayade, who is an ID physician based in Nagpur. And she was actually recently felicitated by the Association of Physicians of India as a towering personality in that central India for spreading the field of ID. And I think she was recognized as a young star and something like that. Nice to get recognized by a society like API for her ID contribution. And then going on to the list of panelists, we have Dr. George K. Verghese, who is one of the senior most ID physicians in our country. And he's our ex-president of Clinical Infectious Disease Society. And then in his tenure, probably I would say that he's done a lot of work in setting up good platform for the Clinical Infectious Disease Society, for which all of us are grateful and thankful for his contribution to the society. And then we have Dr. Ram Gopal Krishnan, who is my senior colleague at Apollo Hospitals, Chennai, my teacher, and probably teacher for Dr. Ashwini also. And he continues to inspire a whole generation of ID physicians. And then he's a keen motivator for every single fellow that gets passed out of our system. Lucky to have him here as one of the panelists. And then we have Dr. Sunita Reddy, is an ID physician. She is board certified in infectious diseases. She practices at Apollo Hospitals, Hyderabad, and she currently is our treasurer of our society too, and wise person to have in the panel here. And then we have Dr. Neha Gupta, last but not the least, and she is a colleague of mine. Both of us passed out ID at the same point of time, and she's based in Delhi at the Medanta Hospital. And then nice to have her here too. And then I would hand over the session to Dr. Ashwini Tayade. Ashwini, you can please start. The session is Ask Us Anything. Even before we went on live, we already had around 3-4 questions. Probably
that's
more questions for us. Thank you.
Yeah, that's what I was reading. Thanks, Nambi. It's been a wonderful platform, and the series has been went and recognized all throughout very well. We have already a lot of questions been answered by all experts in last 2 sessions. So whatever is left, we are going to cover it, try to cover it today. What I'll do is I'll have a few set of questions from last unanswered set, and then whatever questions we keep getting, like we have seen already 6 questions are there pending. So those questions will rope in between. So Dr. RGK has joined.
Yep. Can you see me?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay. So let's start. This is a field where it's changing so fast. Like last week's session, whatever we have, we might have few changes from that, like based on drugs, based on infection control practices, new guidelines. So everything is changing so fast. There will be few topics we'll be repeating again, even if they were covered in last talks as well. So this is a wonderful article. Before starting this, I'll just cover this article. So this is regarding asymptomatic transmission. And Aron et al., what they have found that this was point prevalence survey from healthcare hospital. So 76 residents were tested, out of which 63% had positive RT-PCR and 56% were asymptomatic. The important point is 24 out of them eventually became symptomatic, and they were then labeled as pre-symptomatic. The other interesting part is all of these categories, pre-symptomatic, asymptomatic, had quantitative viral load in the same range. And they did cultures for all the 70%, 71% pre-symptomatic population, and they found out that it was a viable culture between day 1 to day 6, and 26% of them died. So all of us are aware that healthcare worker, the mortality is higher because the viral load which is exposed is higher, and because the amount of stress whatever is there. So 2 important things they have highlighted is cluster testing in all these areas, like long-term care facilities, healthcare workers, prisons, periodic testing for homeless shelters. So asymptomatic population in India, as per the ICMR published data, is somewhere around 69%. So we know, all of us know, asymptomatic population is significant. So how do we go about it? Dr. Achike would like to take this. Where do we admit them? Whether we go home quarantine them, we send them to COVID care center?
Yeah, so as I'm sure you are aware, ICMR has come out with guidelines on this very recently, in a day or so. But what the wrong answer here is to admit the patient, right? You never want to use up a healthcare facility bed in a patient who has no symptoms. It is not good for that patient, and it certainly is not good for the healthcare system, because all you're getting is somebody who can potentially spread the disease within a healthcare system, and in return, you're really not doing anything for the patient. So the answer definitely should not be a hospital. In my opinion, it should be home quarantine. If you are asymptomatic, there is no reason to take you away from your home setting and put you in another place where you'll have to look for food, you'll have to look for what to do throughout the day, etc., etc. It is strict home quarantine, and home quarantine can be enforced electronically. The government has some guidelines for that. But to keep it very simple, if you call somebody every day, make sure they're at home, they're not moving around, and they finish that 14-day period of home quarantine, that is more than enough. Because let me tell you that at some point or the other in the next year or two, most of us will probably pick up this infection, and most of us will probably have asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic infection. Certainly the younger among us, the ones without comorbidity. So there's no way you can actually formally admit them even in a non-healthcare facility. Home quarantine is the way to go.
Home quarantine is a way to go, but then Indian scenario where like one of our patient, same family, 25 other people who were living in a small home of 2-3 bedroom house, all of them turned out to be positive. So if we have such scenario and majority of the hotspot areas have similar scenarios, so how do you plan home quarantine for all these patients?
Yeah.
So in that case, COVID care center sounds to be a better option.
Yeah, COVID care centers will be an exceedingly expensive option in patients who can't afford to socially distance themselves at home. If the government has resources, that is what they can do. But there is absolutely nothing wrong with facilitating this at home. Okay, so you can individually assess the home situation of a person. If it is 25 to a room and the others have no symptoms, or you think they have not been infected, you can only think that, then perhaps you could put them in a COVID care center. But somebody who has reasonable ability to physically distance should be at home. And you can see the guidelines, elaborate guidelines have just come up within the last couple of days on this.
So it was yesterday's guideline. Yeah.
So the wrong answer is the hospital. That is clearly the wrong answer. It's either home or perhaps a dedicated center.
Okay. So even, yesterday's guideline says the same based on your symptoms, whether it is mild, moderate, severe, we have to segregate them to COVID care center, COVID health center or hospital based on your severity, with all these protocols to be followed. The point here is, if we are putting all those patients in COVID care center, how do we triage them? So this guideline says if it is mild, it goes to COVID care center. If it is moderate, based on the respiratory rate and saturation, it goes to COVID health center, and severe definitely goes to your ICU facility. But what about those who are going to be there in COVID care center? How do you triage them? How do you decide who will be at high risk and who needs extra monitoring? So do we need to offer them basic labs, X-ray or anything else before planning or before triaging all these patients? Or the triage should be based on only the clinical presentation like the ICMR guidelines says?
You want me to take that, Ashwini, or one of the others?
Dr. George or Dr. Sunita? Sir, you are there. Okay. Yes, sir.
Okay. I mean, I think to be practical in our country, we'll have to go primarily clinically. Now, when they become sick, which will hopefully be picked up with your rapid respiratory rate, fever, worsening fever, and dropping saturation, then they will need to be shifted, and then the issue of investigation comes, because it is practically difficult, I think, to evaluate everybody who is very mildly symptomatic in any major way. And I'm not so sure in my mind a CT scan is CT scan is useful, no doubt. it's
CT
probably...
scan, yeah, I understand. CT scan will be way too expensive and practically not possible for public health scenario.
Yeah.
But what about doing baseline CBC, CRP, which definitely give us some prognostication, and then get their risk comorbidities and triage them and decide whether they need excess care, excess monitoring as compared to normal population. So that way we can save our healthcare resources.
One can't argue against it, but then there has to be a system in place to do that. Without a system, it won't help. So when you send them to a COVID care center, ideally somebody has to see.
Somebody has to see, agree. But then that...
and at that point, some tests have to probably go.
Okay. So shall we say
primarily the triaging will have to be clinical.
So the clinical triaging is good enough, and the tests should be decided based on the progression of the disease. That's what you say, or you prefer all of them to be given baseline testing?
Ideally, baseline testing would be useful, but the practicality is all that I'm talking about. It depends on how things are set up. So if somebody is going to see and then triage, at that point of time, one would send tests. If a healthcare worker is going to see and feels it is stable and then triaged, it will come only later. It's only it will happen when some deterioration occurs. So it depends on how the system works. And I think no system is uniform.
True. Okay. Any role about chest X-ray?
Chest X-ray probably has got low sensitivity at this point of time. So if they're not symptomatic, they're not hypoxic, it's unlikely you'll pick up too much, chest X-ray. So it depends on whether your suspicion for a conventional pneumonia, for example, is high. So it depends on all that. Otherwise, if you're thinking of pure COVID disease, the yield of a chest X-ray is probably poor.
Okay. So where do we place imaging or CT chest in all these patients who are asymptomatic? So is there any significant role, because we have enough data that CT in asymptomatic population is...
Clearly the CT is useful, but we need to understand that we are practicing in India and which population one is dealing with. So if it, so to do a screening CT and admission in a relatively minimally symptomatic person is probably not the best way of utilizing things. May it give information? Yes, it may give information.
So to be very precise, if we plan to do CT somewhere like in pre-op population where we are checking them pre-operatively, whether they are fit enough or, to rule out the risk of COVID, will planning CT will be advisable or not? Dr. Sonita, you want to take this?
Ashwini, if you're talking about screening patients with asymptomatic, where you're just quarantining them at their house or in a COVID care center, then you just can go with clinical evaluation, including a pulse oximetry, and that would probably suffice it all. If you have any abnormalities in the respiratory rate or oxygen saturations or in their symptomatology, then you can decide if you want to do any further investigations at that point. If they're clinically stable with the normal pulse ox, I would probably just leave it at that. But when you're talking about pre-op screening, now that's a different ballgame. There you're talking about a general population. You're not talking about a high-risk contact or an asymptomatic person who's been here you're talking about asymptomatic person with the diseases. You already died. They had a known contact. But when you're talking about a general population then you have to see the prevalence of the disease in your community. The prevalence is changing from place to place. For example, in Mumbai, the prevalence is relatively much higher than in a place like Hyderabad, which has much less to the extent of information that we have. Again, district to district, locality to locality, all of this information also will make a difference. So if your prevalence is low, doing a CT may or may not help you, because the data that we have in terms of even from the Diamond Princess data, you are talking about known contacts and then you're screening them. But when you're talking about a pre-op screening, you're talking about where you don't know that you're assuming that there's no known contact in this case. And again, that's where you need to know the prevalence in the or in the community as well. So how will CT help you? If the CT shows some changes, does that mean it's because of COVID? Does it mean because of something else? And if the CT is normal, what does it mean? If the CT is normal, it doesn't really rule out that you do that.
But 75% sensitivity somewhere, right?
Again, since your positive predictive value is also dependent on your prevalence. If the prevalence is low, then it totally screws up your numbers. So if your prevalence is low, your positive predictive value is going to significantly be lower. So doing a CT in a low prevalence setting may not give you that much of information that you think you would want. And if your CT is normal, it doesn't tell you that you're not in the asymptomatic phase either. You still have to take care of all the precautions that you should normally take in terms of infection control protocol. So normal CT will not make you not worry about exposure to COVID for this particular patient. And they can always develop the symptoms a few days after the surgery. So what would you do at that point? So is it being done? Yes, it is being done. Is it foolproof technique? No, it is not foolproof technique.
So in low prevalence setting, there is no point in going ahead with RT-PCR, CT preoperatively. That if we say that, is it good enough?
Yeah, it's not going to help you too much, except for having a placebo effect.
True, there are quite a few chances we might miss it and we'll mess it up. Yeah, as far as infection control aspect is concerned. So yeah, that's what this data which you have already covered. So this lady, this part of it was covered in yesterday's talk as well. So 23-year female, she is admitted with fever, cough, vitals are stable, there is no consolidation. Bit of lymphopenia, RT-PCR is positive, so she has been isolated. The problem comes here now at day 14 of routine screening, it is positive. Till day 30, she was screened repeatedly and it is still positive. So how do we plan our discharge policy? Is there any clear-cut guideline which says, all guidelines says we need to have 2 negative PCRs, but when should we do this? And post 14 days, if it is positive, is there any significant frequency guideline which gives us an idea? How do we plan it post 14 days if it is negative? Dr. Neha, would you like to take this?
Okay. So, hi Ashwini, thank you. So this patient has now improved?
Yeah, clinically she is absolutely fine. It's just because PCR is positive, she is there. Sitting in the ward, emotionally traumatized.
Correct.
Being
so
there
now,
in the ward for a month.
Yeah. So first of all, there are 2 issues here. One is we all now know that like RT-PCR positivity does not really indicate that a virus does not correlate with the virus isolation. We have this data from Nature, as well as Dr. Rajiv Soman had elaborated this in the previous SIDS webinar. Now, even if the RT-PCR is positive and if the patient is asymptomatic, we have now guidelines for the home quarantine. So this patient definitely can be discharged if she is completely asymptomatic and then can be monitored at home with repeated testing probably after 7 days or so. So government of Maharashtra, as of now, they are suggesting like if you can have just 1 PCR negative, and if the patient is negative, then the patient can be discharged from the hospital. Maybe they can go to the COVID center, care center, or even to the home. They can go back home if they have the facility.
Okay, RGK sir, you want to add something to this?
Yeah, so I'm actually a believer in treating the patient, not the report. So as you know, you said that Nature paper said that there's no live virus after 9 days. So I am convinced that if you have a viral infection, whatever that infection is, if you've clinically gotten better and you're eating well, you're clinically stable, then you need to discharge that patient to home quarantine. Right? That patient doesn't need to stay in the hospital for clinical reasons, but needs to stay in home quarantine for public health reasons. So now the ICMR has given you a clear outlet where you can keep these people at home. I actually would follow the CDC guidelines. You need to move to those. If your patient is fit and well, they give a length of 7 days. They have a testing-based strategy, which we have been following. But we need to move to a non-test-based strategy. Patient is doing well, discharge them to home quarantine, irrespective of the PCR report. We need to move to that. These patients are probably not infectious. They're just taking up hospital beds, which should be used for people who need them. I'm told in Mumbai, they are short of ICU beds. They're short of beds in Mumbai. They have so many patients. So
even in Nagpur, we are short of ICU beds and all these asymptomatic people are occupying just because the PCR is positive.
Yeah,
so
send them home.
But that is the protocol which has to be decided. Yes, but then that is what should be way ahead because. Sorry, sir. Yeah, that is what I guess we need to decide because in coming days, all of us know we are going to get bombarded with number of cases, and we need to have policies which are user friendly and which will give us more space for the patients who need it. So what about viral shedding? We were discussing just now, viral shedding is definitely there. What about viral shedding in GI versus nasal? And is there any possibility of fecal-oral transmission? Because we know GI shedding is definitely there. Is there any paper which has confirmed this, Dr. George?
Yeah, viral shedding is probably there in the gut. And we've actually known that coronavirus is a gut organism since days. In fact, I have worked on coronavirus in the mid-70s as part of a evaluation of tropical sprue. So coronavirus are there in the upper respiratory tract and in the gut, and it's a well-known cause of upper respiratory infection and to some extent gastroenteritis. But I seriously don't think that COVID disease is primarily transmitted via the gut. So the usual precautions of hand hygiene will take care of, by and large, of possible gut-related transmission. But I think it's a very minor player. It's primarily a respiratory illness, and we all need to remember that. And we need so mask wearing, hand hygiene is going to be a part of life for quite a few months, and that's the reality of things. And physical distancing. I don't want to call it social distancing. Physical distancing. Okay. Where the social distancing word came around. Total paradox. The idea is not to have social distancing, but physical distancing. In fact, you should encourage people to have more social contact. It's very easy nowadays with a phone and various other things.
And even this Zoom app.
So
we know that GI shedding. We know that GI shedding is pretty significant and it's prolonged as compared to nasal shedding.
Yes.
So as far as this clearance or test of loss of infectivity is concerned, what should be given prominence? Nasal screening per se, or is there any role of testing stool or any other sample for clearance?
If it's part of a study, yes, but I don't think otherwise we get into stool testing at all. If it's part of a study, somebody is trying to evaluate something, somebody is trying to study something, somebody is trying to prove something, there's a rule for stool testing. Otherwise, keep out of it. There is no hard evidence now that it's a major cause of clinical disease or clinical spread of disease.
Okay, so basically it's like we should follow the home testing for CDC guideline, and we should discharge them if they are clinically better rather than testing them.
And I think the government will reach that, the ICMR and the ministry will reach that sooner rather than later. I mean, I think they're aware of what is happening. So in your big cities like Mumbai, Nagpur, etc., as you're saying, it's not it's possible in some other places because the numbers are not that much. Once the prevalence increases, everybody will become wise and will move in the right direction.
So hopefully we'll get the guidelines soon. Sheshadri, this is stuck. It's not, okay. Moving on to the next case. This is 60-year female from high-risk area where already 2-3 patients have been reported. Though she says she was not in contact with any of them, presented with ARDS, got intubated, had lymphopenia, elevated CRP, mildly elevated LDH. So all the signs which were supportive of COVID. But then RT-PCR was negative twice from COVID, done from the government setup. Patient is clinically worsening. We did film array for respiratory panel to know whether there is something else which is going on, but that is also negative. So how do we go about this patient? How do I diagnose it? How do I prove or disprove COVID in this patient? The other issues associated with this patient is how do I plan isolation, the amount of PPE and other expenditure associated with this when you label them as COVID suspect. And is there any other testing modality, Dr. Sunita?
Okay, so when you're looking for the diagnosis of this patient, first of all, you should always think that just because you're in a COVID locality does not mean everything is COVID. You have to look for other differential diagnoses as well. So again, reassess your clinical picture and see what are the other possibilities and try to diagnose the case. And we also know that in terms of RT-PCR testing for COVID, sensitivity for a nasopharyngeal swab is between 60 and 70%, and for throat swab is much lesser. Whereas again, if you do an endotracheal or a BAL sample, it's a much higher sensitivity. So you want to relook at what sample was sent. If the previous RT-PCR was sent from a nasopharyngeal or a throat swab, then it's worthwhile sending a BAL or an endotracheal sample, depending on the clinical picture. If the patient is already on with the ARDS kind of a picture, then you may not be able to do a bronchoscopy, but at least an endotracheal sample should not be very difficult to get. So yes, there have been cases where it took about 3 or 4 samples also to diagnose positivity. And if you're in a high prevalence area, you're mentioning that it is here, I would definitely re-look at getting a proper sample collected in a proper way. And until that point, especially if you're unless you have an alternative diagnosis that you have proven, you would want to continue the isolation precautions with PPE. Yes, it would mean that you will have to use more PPE. The important thing is you have to establish a diagnosis. If you're not sure of your diagnosis, then you recheck your PCR and see if
so
you
we have done FILMARRAY, we have ruled out other etiologies, and the primary suspicion is COVID per se actually. So is there any testing modality apart from RT-PCR which we can try?
If you want to do an serological test, if the symptoms have been more than 5 to 7 days, then you can potentially do serology, but serology is ideally not done in the early part of the disease because serology will be negative. You can do it only after a period of time, and even that is not necessarily been very helpful in a lot of cases here because it also concerned with the quality of testing kits itself, which have been a problem worldwide, not just in India. Even in US CDC had issues with the kits that they had procured in the past. So as long as we have reasonably good kits, then we should be okay with doing serological tests. But again, we have to take it with a pinch of salt at the moment in the country where ICMR had issued concerns about the serological test. Again, serological tests should not be done in the early part of the course of the disease, should be done much later. Ideally, serology is used for population-based testing to see if they have been exposed to the disease in the past, or do they have immunity or not. And that's the major place where you would, the role of the serology is.
Now that ICMR has given warning against use of the serology kits and they have taken it back, is there any other option apart from serology?
Can I make a small point?
Yes, sir, please.
Okay. Now, if CT is feasible here, this is the eminent candidate for doing a
CT was done. I couldn't get the film. Okay. CT was done, and it was typical ground glassing, more of a COVID picture. So it was again fitting in with this.
You believe it is COVID. The test is not that crucial. I think one should be able to live both ways. Test is negative, test is positive. Test positive does not mean the end of the world. Test negative also doesn't mean that everything is fine. To be realistic on what the clinical situation is. Otherwise, we are going to have problems. Okay.
So similarly,
serology, I had a point about serology. See, serology all over the world, including the US and Europe, has been licensed without adequate quality checks. Usually the FDA or some standard body does tests before any test is released. In this pandemic era, they have released tests based on the company's perceptions of the test being fine. That is a huge problem. Okay. And that is what is happening. Also understand that most IgM tests are not great. The IgG is potentially more useful. There's a lot of overlap now. How specific is the test is the most important thing. As I told you, coronavirus has been around for a long time. Is the specificity of some of these tests great? We really don't know the answer. So you can have both false positives and false negatives. And it's not surprising that the tests have performed poorly. Okay, so if
How are we targeting on epidemiological data without serological testing now? Is there any other way out of going about the epidemiological data? And even WHO doesn't recommend use of antibody testing for diagnosis as such. Ajike sir?
Simple. Don't do serology for clinical purposes. The tests are useless.
So, but for epidemiological purpose, we can still go ahead with serology.
No, we need better tests for that as well, because there they're looking at reliable IgGs. They're looking at neutralizing antibodies, which would protect, which would help you devise a vaccine. We need better tests. So don't jump in with the current serological tests available. Just don't do that. They're useless.
What about use of LAMP or GeneXpert here, Safid?
Yeah, PCR techniques are certainly validated, much better studied. Many of them are FDA cleared. Any lab which has expertise in doing them, say an NABL accredited lab approved by ICMR, should definitely introduce whatever platform is internationally approved, in addition to platforms produced in India, which have been well validated. There's no issue with PCR testing there.
Okay, right. So moving on to a next one, like we are discussing about neutralizing antibodies. So there are papers from Korea and other parts of the world where they are doubt about reconfirmation or reinfection of new cases. So this paper, they say basically 30% of the patient failed to develop high titers of neutralizing antibody. But even if the titers were low, all of them recovered in similar span, irrespective of the titer, neutralizing antibody titer. And the other important point was the neutralizing antibody titer in a few patients was less than detectable limit. So the postulate is that there is some other immune mechanism, like including T cell, which might be contributing to recovery of all these patients. So question to Dr. Neha, what is the rate of reinfection? What are the stats available all over the world? Any recent literature? And do we have any cases from India?
Okay, to my
or any predictions, something?
So there have been some reports of reinfections in other places as such, but to my knowledge from India, we don't have much data on the reinfection.
Okay. Dr. Sunita, you want to add something?
So again, I agree with Neha. We don't have too much data from the Indian context. If you're talking about data even from the other countries, it's not very clear. There have been reports from South Korea that they have had some patients who had the disease and who came back again with the repeat test positivity. Now, what does that mean? Is the data is not very clear in that. Is it because they have a reinfection or a relapse, or are they just PCR positive? You can have a dead virus being detected by PCR. So how many days after the illness did the PCR become positive? All of that information still is yet to come out. So we really don't know how to interpret the information that has come out. We only have bits and pieces of information. We need to get more.
So whether it was reconfirmation or reinfection, it's still debatable and we need more data about it.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Moving on to next one. Meanwhile, we are getting a lot of questions about how do we manage those outpatients patients were in small clinics. Once the lockdown opens, at least those who are in green zone, there is a question, though we had already covered this session in Dr. Ramsubbu has covered this, but there are still a lot of questions coming up regarding how do we manage smaller clinics once lockdown open up. Dr. George, you want to take this?
Well, that is the hardest question of all, okay, to honestly answer, okay. Now, I think even in small clinics, I'm talking of a small clinic with very little space around. Okay, I'm talking of those kind of, I'm imagining that kind of small clinic. It's a very hard call to manage problems there. I think to be practical, one first has to make phone calls or video calls or something, see what the problem is. Okay, try and figure out whether it is a possible COVID-like illness. If it's a COVID-like illness, it's probably better for your health and for the health of many others that if they're referred to an appropriate place for further evaluation. If they seem to have some other issues, then definitely you should go ahead and see. You probably have to schedule appointments. Now, how much equipment do you need? You need to schedule appointments so there's no overcrowding in your clinic. That is kind of very important. Gone are the days where you can have people overflowing in your clinic. So now how much equipment do you need in your clinic? Therein is again an issue. Ideally, when you read about what is happening all over the world, most of the transmission has occurred in areas where you don't know where the problem is. In an ICU, in a full PPE cover, the transmission of infection is actually genuinely pretty low. So it is in the unknown setting when the threshold for infection is high. So it's in the unknown setting where you need protection as much as possible. The most important protection is a mask. Now, what kind of mask is again a hard call. If you don't know what the population you're dealing with and you're in a reasonably high, moderate prevalence zone, you should probably wear an N95 and take care of it and seek and use the 5-bag principle, 5-mask principle, and change it daily and try and protect yourself with some basic protective cover. If you're in a lower infection zone, a conventional 3-layer surgical mask is probably enough. So it depends on what you're seeing. So my first plea is that you probably should screen the patient with a phone or a video or something like that to know what you're dealing with. If the whole story sounds very much like a upper respiratory infection, probably wiser to send them off to a larger setup, which is equipped to handle such things. Okay, and if not, go ahead and do it with at least some kind of basic precautions. Hand hygiene is important after every case, all those things there. And try and not to overcrowd your OPD.
Next question is to Dr. Neha. One question is, which are the body fluids which can harbor or which have been tested positive for COVID virus?
So among the, I would say that we know about the nasopharyngeal swabs, oropharyngeal swabs, then stool specimens, and there the RT-PCR positivity from the Chinese literature has been close to 30%. Among blood, the RT-PCR positivity has been just 1%, and it has not been found in the amniotic fluid. So that is like pregnancy or that is, the vertical transmission is really not known, or it is not there so far in COVID-19.
Okay. Yeah, please go ahead.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. There was a paper from France where they have tested viral load from water samples, and viral load correlated with the amount of peak. So we have one question whether there is CVS testing and the amount of virus found in it. Dr. Ajike, you want to take this question?
I'm really not aware of this paper. In water supply samples, is that what you said?
Basically, it was STP, which they have quoted from this France paper. But now the question here is whether from sewage samples, is there any paper which have mentioned about positivity of the virus?
Yeah, so I have seen something to that effect that if you analyze sewage samples, you can find evidence of SARS-CoV-2, and they can actually use that as a marker of shedding or how big is SARS-CoV-2 a problem in that community. Because as you know, we tend to shed virus in the stool much longer than in other specimens. It probably is not infectious, and certainly, as has been said, fecal-oral transmission has not been detected. As an epidemiological tool, pending availability of good serologies, you could do things like this in the environment in sewage, which will suggest that people are shedding it for a prolonged period of time, convalescent carriers, asymptomatics, pre-symptomatics, symptomatics. So it's a good epidemiological tool if you don't have a good serological test report.
Can be used as a good epidemiology tool, nothing else.
We need more studies, but that's one of the things people were thinking of looking at.
Okay. Where is my screen? Okay. Any word on vaccine availability and the role of vaccine in our state's present scenario? Dr. Sunita?
Everybody is now talking about herd immunity and how do you get a herd immunity? Will you have vaccines available? We all know that vaccines are not going to be that readily coming forward. There are trials that are going on in terms of vaccines. There are RNA vaccine trials as well as COVID-19 specific trials. Now, any of these trials are still very early stages, and will take at least another good 12 to 18 months at the earliest before you can get a vaccine. The earliest, one trial was started, I believe, in Europe with two volunteers, but most of them are in preclinical phase, phase 1 and phase 2. So it's a long way to come up before we get a vaccine.
So even if we get a vaccine, what about the efficacy of the vaccine? Our flu vaccine per se is 70% efficacy. And then whatever patients we are having, the recovery neutralizing antibody titer per se is so low. So how sure we are that vaccine is going to work?
And for you to get the vaccine, it's not just about getting the vaccine. The vaccine should be real good. Efficacy is also important. And you should be in a position to do a mass production. How are you going to distribute the vaccine if and when you get the vaccine? Is the country who's going to manufacture it going to get the priority, or is the country that's going to have a high prevalence of the disease, or the country that's more richer that's going to get the vaccine? All of these questions also will have to be answered. But again, it's a long way before you can get a vaccine which really works without side effects, and it should be easily in a position to easily administer, and it should be affordable. So a lot of issues will come up.
So will it be too optimistic sentence if we say vaccine will solve all our problems? Dr. George, you want to say something on this?
I don't want to say anything. I mean, I don't want to be the bad guy around. It's too early to say whether the vaccine, as Sunita said, it's a little early in the vaccine. But having said that, I think everybody is aware that Serum Institute of India is working on the Oxford vaccine and has actually taken the risk of started manufacturing.
Yeah, they've started phase 1, yeah.
Not phase 1, they started manufacturing in the hope that the vaccine will work. So if the vaccine works, we may get a vaccine much earlier than if the Oxford vaccine works. So that is what they started manufacturing. And they've taken the risk of manufacturing, and they say they should make it should become available by September, August, by September. That's what Serum Institute director is saying. Okay, it's a separate issue that the trials have just started. So if the trials work, we'll probably have a reasonable amount of dosing. He's talking of 5 million doses by September is what he's talking of.
So another 5-6 months.
And it should not have major side effects. Very important, because you all are familiar with the swine flu episode which occurred many years ago, which resulted in GBS. So there are two things here. The vaccine has to work. There should not be too much of antigenic shift, and there should not be too much side effects. Okay. So if all this works, there is one vaccine which is people have started manufacturing in this country, and I think it's common knowledge.
Okay, it's good to know, actually, heartening. Dr. Neha, would you like to take this? What is the herd immunity status, and do we really have, can we really target it, and how soon? I know the question is very difficult and we don't have much data about it.
So as we all know, herd immunity or immunity in the community to prevent person-to-person transmission, that will happen if close to 60 to 80% of the community is affected. That means either they are vaccinated or they have acquired illness. So here vaccination is really out for quite some time. So to whatever data, like from I'm not aware in India how much, what is the percentage of infectivity. As far as I know, I think it's 2 to 3% of the population right now which is affected. I think Dr. RGK can suggest, they can say more, but 60 to 80% of the population needs to be affected. And that's when we will acquire herd immunity. So,
RGK sir, you want to add something?
No, I see, unless you have good serological data, you can't estimate the percentage of the population that's infected. Because if you do PCR testing, that's a function of PCR testing. You do more tests, etc., etc. So without serological testing, we don't know.
Okay, can I say something?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
There is some data from the US with slightly better, I'm using my terms carefully, slightly better serological tests. Okay, and the data from New York is that about in random sampling, it's based on people coming to a grocery store and a lot of problems there, but approximately 20% serological prevalence in New York, which is a high infection area. In Santa Clara, which seems to be a lower infection area, it was about 4%. So there is now community spread. Now, what we don't know is how much community spread we have. Now, if you believe that our mortality does not at this point seem to be too high, I want to bring an optimistic note here. Only time will, the next few weeks will tell you where we are heading. At this point, we can all look into the black box and anybody can say anything they want. So whether we are genuinely not going to have major problems or not. So we are looking at mortality in terms of proven infections. The number at this point of time is about 1,000, which is actually objectively stated phenomenal for a country with a 1.3 billion population. So even if you up that number, so you really need to look at severe disease and mortality rates. Okay, so even if you multiply that number, mortality number by 1,000 or even 2,000, which is probably a better idea of prevalence, we still don't have huge amounts of prevalence going on at this point of time.
As of
now,
which is good thing.
What does it mean? Either it means that we've had some related bug or some other thing going around, and therefore we are relatively slightly protected. I don't think it is temperature. I doubt very much it is BCG. I doubt very much whether it is polio vaccine. Okay. Temperature will probably be handy to kill circulating virus in the air. I'm not sure it's going to do else too much. It doesn't seem to be genetics too, because if you look at the data from the UK, lots of frontline people who have died are actually of Asian and Indian origin. So it doesn't look like it is our genes which is helping us too much. So in which case it means that we've had some exposure to something very closely related, which is there. If that number maintains, if it's going to peak like everywhere else, then it means nothing.
Okay, good. You have answered 3-4 questions in this. So about BCG, temperature, everything has been covered. That's really good. I guess quite a few of them had similar questions. Coming to practical issues, how do we triage these chemo patients? Like yesterday, I had one chap who got admitted for rituximab. There are patients who are coming up for biologicals, chemo patients who are coming, though they have made a guideline to defer the chemo and a weekly chemo have been changed to thrice a week chemo, something like that. Do we need to screen them, keeping in mind that they are a high-risk population? If we screen them, whether do you place them? Like I have a separate floor assigned for new admission, but will I be justified in putting this high-risk patient to a separate floor, knowing that this patient has 0 score and he is very low-risk candidate? And how do we screen them? How do we plan them? Dr. Sunita?
Ashwini, this is a challenge that we are facing constantly, and even today we've been trying to discuss and figure out how to handle this. Fortunately, I can tell you what we are trying to do at this point. For patients who are coming for dialysis, for example, we kind of maintain a distance between the beds so that you can you will avoid cross infections between patients. This is provided. So we have multiple steps of screening. The moment somebody enters into the hospital, at the entrance, we have every patient that comes into the system will be triaged. They answer a set of questions which include their history of symptoms like fever, cough, runny nose, sore throat, loss of smell, or do they come from a containment zone, and so on. If travel history, contact history. If there are none of these symptoms present, then you check the temperature, and if they're afebrile, then they go to the regular dialysis unit where they're still maintained with a distance of 6 feet between the beds so that the risk of cross infections are less, and droplet precautions are followed for every single patient that comes into the hospital, into the dialysis unit. Whereas if you're looking at any of these risks that may be present, then they automatically have to get screened for COVID when they come into the hospital. For example, if they have a fever and cough or shortness of breath, then they go into a separate area where they screen for COVID via PCR, and once the PCR is negative, then they come into the main building. So this is what we do in the hospital, which is a challenge, yes, especially for people who are coming on a regular basis. We do have this challenge.
Someone who is from high risk or hotspot area and he's coming for weekly dialysis, how do we post it or how do we plan it? We can't be checking them every week.
Yes. For some of those who are coming from a containment zone, then we try to put them separately, do not mix them with the rest of the patients in the dialysis unit. We have a separate room where we do dialysis for the patients in a separate area.
Okay. And what about chemo patients?
Sunita, I suppose you're giving everyone a mask.
Every patient that comes into the hospital is masked. Every patient, every staff is all masked. Droplet precautions are maintained at any given time. Irrespective of what the risk factor is, droplet precautions are maintained.
Dr. Neha, do you have any separate protocol for these patients?
So in both Medanta and Fortis Hospital where we are working, so every patient who comes in, again, as Dr. Sunita has mentioned, has to go through the triage. And in our center, we actually send every patient for the, we send RT-PCR for every patient as well. So this is the hospital policy, because there is facility to do the RT-PCR, they are checked for the RT-PCR. But
Okay.
And I would for those who are coming from the containment zone, like if suppose the patient has had a dialysis, but then after the dialysis, if the patient is going back to their home and is completely following the lockdown, then the possibility of him perhaps acquiring infection also becomes less.
Okay, so you are lucky enough to have PCR for all those patients actually. A question to Dr. RGK from one of our viewers is, a healthcare worker who was not posted in COVID ward, but then the hospital is taking COVID patients and he develops URI. How do we manage him? Do we need to test him? Do we need to quarantine him?
Yeah, you definitely need to quarantine him. It's 14 days at home. Some states make it even 28 days, but it's 14 days as per national policy. Testing would, and you are allowed to test these patients. The ICMR criteria clearly say that if you are a healthcare worker, you are allowed to test. They will have to accept that test. So testing is not an issue. The main purpose of testing obviously is for public health and hospital infection control, not for that patient's individual benefit. So I think testing for a healthcare worker is very reasonable, because if the healthcare worker is positive, you can just, now the new ICMR guidelines clearly help you home quarantine that person or to a specific quarantine area. They don't have to be admitted. So a healthcare worker, you should have a very low threshold for testing because of the multiple infection control issues involved.
Suppose one test comes out negative and it's a low probability thing, can he join his work back in 5 days time, or he has to be in quarantine for 14 days?
No, you know the sensitivity of testing is about 75% with the first test and about 88% with the second test. Or some studies say 88 and even more. So no constellation or number of tests is 100% sensitive. So I think if somebody develops a URI in COVID time, it is the positive or negative. It is 14 days off for them.
Quarantine, yes.
Yes, because the risk of you are missing it with the first negative report is pretty high. These are symptomatic patients, so you will have to quarantine them.
But if someone has his PP, complete PP, and there is no breach of PP, then we don't have to quarantine that person.
Now you're talking about a symptomatic healthcare worker. So the PP is relevant only for picking it up from patients. Now, this healthcare worker could have picked it up from the community, from home. So if you have a symptomatic healthcare worker, the PP history is irrelevant.
Okay.
Right? So it's irrelevant.
So that is just to screen whom to be quarantined and whom not to be quarantined. If he is symptomatic, PP doesn't come into the picture.
Correct.
Okay. This is the area of ophthalm, ENT and dental OPD. I guess we haven't discussed in last all our series. So just a bit few lines about it. Dr. Sunita would like to take this.
Okay, so all of these areas in general are a very high risk area, particularly because they come in, the face-to-face contact is extremely high in each of these areas. So definitely more precautions need to be followed on this. In fact, most, I think, hospitals have literally stopped taking care of patients in these departments unless it's an emergency. What are the precautions that you can reasonably take? For example, if you're talking about an ophthalmic department, let's say, again, the usual precautions when during patient entry into the hospital should be there. The usual, again, waiting area, you have to give appointments such that they don't have to wait for a long period of time, which is a huge challenge in ophthalmic area, because ophthalmic is one area where the waiting time invariably becomes longer because of the dilation of the eyes and so on. So so you have to ensure that there is enough place to space out the patients and they don't have to crowd in the OPD. And when the patient is examined, obviously the patient and the doctor has to be masked. And again, the equipment that they're being used, like the slit lamp slit lamp and so on, every patient visit, they have to be cleaned up with the Bacillol, and the surfaces of the tables and so on has to be cleaned frequently. And yes, can it be done? It can be done, but with appropriate precautions as well. So definitely the patient and the doctor both have to be taking precautions. And for example, when the patient, typically what happens is when you're examining a patient, it's a tendency to talk to the patient as you're examining. But here, when you're having such close contact, you probably should stop the conversation when you're examining and keep the conversation separate from away from the examination time. Tell the patients not to talk, because invariably patients, what they do is when they're talking, they just take the mask off when they're talking because they think it's impolite to talk and because they're not being very clear. So some of the simple techniques that should also be done more cautiously. Any other thoughts?
Anyone else wants to add something to this?
No, I think among those three situations, ophthalmology is a little bit easier because you don't have to open your mouth. Dental and ENT are a nightmare because the whole process is opening your mouth. So we have to definitely use N95s in that situation. We definitely have to self-triage patients very aggressively, self-triage and supervised triage very aggressively. We have to have very good airflow and ventilation in all those areas. So they are very high-risk procedures. So I don't think those kinds of situations are ready to open up yet, unless they are under the supervision of a very good infection control professional in a large hospital. So private ENT clinics, dental clinics are really a big problem right now until we have more experience in this area.
Even the ENT guidelines says OP procedure they should avoid, even if it is like they should try and take them to a theater and then plan those procedures, because majority of them are like aerosol generating procedures. ANC patients we have covered yesterday, and there is a ICMR guidelines to test all those patients even if they are asymptomatic. But this is for high risk areas. So what about those who are in non-high risk areas? We should be screening them as well, or we should not screen them? Dr. Neha, you want to take this?
Yeah, so this was also discussed by Dr. Subra in the webinar, and basically what we know is that, pregnancy, there is, as per the literature, there is no increased risk of mortality and there is no risk of vertical transmission. In a non-hotspot area, I think if then we can, there's no really recommendation to do or perform the test. In that way, like there's no need to do regular testing for the asymptomatic pregnant women in the non-hotspot area.
Dr. George, you agree with her or you have a different opinion?
Yeah, I think that is the official policy, and I see no major reason for change. But again, like what is happening in OTs, similar things are happening in large hospitals. Many people are being tested before they enter basically the thing, if it's possible. If it is, so anything which is planned is unfortunately often tested. If it's a somebody comes in labor or there's an emergency LSAS, precautions are taken and then one goes ahead. There's nothing else one can do. Ideally, one should have a slightly, we're just talking about it yesterday, one needs to have a separate place for unbooked cases, etc., where you know little.
Okay. Dr. Ashike, just a bit update from last week's, whatever you have covered about all these medicine, antivirals and this, any update or anything new which is there?
Only bad news, unfortunately.
HCQ.
Only bad news, unfortunately. Remdesivir, the compassionate use protocol, which was an uncontrolled study, was published in the New England Journal. 68% of patients got better. We don't know how many would have gotten better without the intervention, but there is some promise. We are awaiting the randomized control trial. Hydroxychloroquine, now there are more negative studies, at least with some basic degree of controls, even though they were retrospective. We are awaiting a prospective trial. Favipiravir, again in studies, there is no control data. So as of now, we can't recommend it. And convalescent plasma, only 15 patients in the peer-reviewed literature, no control arm. So you can't recommend it, but it's promising and it's cheap and it's certainly worth trying. So I think this is the so-called soup of the day. People are trying this all over the place, but it's important to have a controlled arm. You can't just give it and say patient got better. You don't know what that patient would have done on their own. Guidelines have changed quite a lot. They are aggressively saying don't give these medications unless it is in the concept or in the context of a clinical trial. And they specifically have an extra warning against this hydroxychloroquine azithromycin cocktail, saying that there is potential benefit of harm there. The IDSA guidelines are out. They've been updated. The surviving sepsis guidelines, the CDC guideline, all of these have been updated in the last couple of weeks, saying please don't use these medicines unless there is proof that they work, which there isn't for any of these medicines.
A word on HCQ prophylaxis, someone wants to know.
HCQ prophylaxis, there is no proof at all that it works. And it can cause harm because HCQ is potentially a harmful drug, prolongs QTC. So I certainly do not recommend it. I am not taking it. What we need is a trial. If a trial shows it works, then we should take it. If not, we should not. Just wait for the trial data.
Okay. One of your viewers wants to know about atypical clinical presentation, encephalitis, dermatological manifestations, and all. Dr. Sunita?
So, yeah, atypical manifestations, there are several different atypical manifestations that are being talked about. From the initial data that came out with conjunctivitis, where the ophthalmologist was the one who actually started talking about this disease as well, to skin manifestations, which include the manifestations on the foot manifestations. Now, more recently, there are data that young people who are coming down with strokes can be a manifestation of COVID. Again, a lot of these patients have a prodromal symptom with fever and respiratory symptoms, and then subsequently coming down with the stroke-like symptoms. So a lot of atypical symptoms that we need to look for, and more probably will come in as we go along. Again, myocarditis is another thing, people coming down with the heart block. So any unexplained heart blocks is something that's raising concerns, as well as now a lot of cardiologists are scared even just with the myocardial infarction. So all of this, the thing that to remember is these are rare manifestations. So still the commonest cause for a stroke is still the regular hypertension or other embolic phenomenon, and COVID would not be the #1 cause for a stroke even today. So just because you have an atypical manifestation, do not jump the gun. Like Guillain-Barré can occur with multiple other conditions. Don't think that everyone who's coming with a stroke or MI is COVID.
What about conjunctivitis? How often do we see conjunctivitis in these patients?
Personally, I haven't seen any.
Okay.
Just seen from the literature.
Right. How about disposal of body? There is a clear-cut guideline from Government of India about disposal of body. Dr. George? George, if you want to say something. You want to take
Nothing.
this?
I only hope that people don't get, body gets treated decently and people don't get thrashed on the way in the attempt of burial, which has happened in Chennai. Okay, so
And that was really
we hope and pray
unfortunate.
that,
Yes.
we hope and pray that such things don't happen. Otherwise, I think the guidelines are there. There's nothing to say.
Okay. Dr. Neha, just a few lines about the disposal of the body. What is the recommendation?
So as far as I think the guideline is there and we can go through it. Basically the burial also has to be deep, apparently as per the WHO. So it has to be 12 feet. This is what I know.
Okay.
I don't know really much into the details of this as such.
Okay, okay, let's move on. So the commonest question which troubles all of us, N95 versus surgical mask, where to use it, what to use it, and the reuse of PP. Dr. RGK, are you there, sir?
Yep.
Yeah.
So that should answer my question. But the caveat is that in
Surgical mask. Okay.
non-aerosol generating areas, okay, that is the caveat. So if you are generating aerosols, for instance, endotracheal intubation, bronchoscopy, in situ spirometry, nebulizer treatments, no question, you need N95s. But for regular outpatient patient care, mask on the patient, mask on yourself. It could even be a homemade or a surgical mask for the patient and a surgical mask for the healthcare provider. Certain specialties, like you said, ENT, dental, etc., certainly N95 there. So that's a rough summary, and the IDSA guidelines also.
IDSA totally agrees with that, and it has clearly given the evidence that it's like only for respiratory procedures, aerosol generating procedure, you need N95. What about reuse of N95? We have some guidelines from AIM, whether it should be hydrogen peroxide, whether it should be the 5-mask strategy. Any comments about that, Dr. Sunita?
There are a lot of data in terms of how to reprocess N95 masks. One thing that we have to remember is whatever you do, if the mask is obviously soiled, you cannot recycle them or reuse them. With various techniques, you can always look it up. And the other thing that bothers me is reusing masks that somebody else has used. Generally a little bit more of a difficult thing. So I would prefer the AIMS protocol where they've given 5 masks
label and
recycle it for yourselves rather than let the mask be changed from person to person.
Okay, fair enough. Okay. Disinfectant tunnel, government has definitely come up with a guideline against the use of disinfectant tunnel. Hope people have stopped using disinfectant tunnel as of now. So moving on to the most debatable part of the topic, as the lockdown is going to be in majority of the areas, at least those who are in green zone. There are lots of mathematical models about the projection, how the things are going to be there, what is the exact expected number of patients we are going to get post-lockdown. And there are many more graphs apart from these which are coming up, and there are many more papers which are coming up. So this is the exact number of samples what we have tested as on date, and the exact number of active cases what the ICMR or Ministry of Health Welfare website gives us. So the question to all of you is, where do we stand now and what is the expected projection? Dr. George?
Okay, I'm a slight optimist. Okay, I want you to take you back to 2002, 2003, when the SARS epidemic was going on.
Okay.
It started in November 2019. It ended for no known reason in July 2003. Okay, we have no explanation. I don't think we got herd immunity. It just went off. I'm optimistic that something similar
That's
will
really
happen.
Optimist, yeah.
Will happen.
And everyone would love to be this optimism.
I know I'm arguing against reason, okay, but I'm trying to be optimistic. We can only live on optimism. If you look at the doomsday predictions, which all mathematical models give you, you will not wake up in the morning. So you might as well enjoy your day, relax a little bit, and smile once in a while. Okay, so I'm not a smiling person. Okay.
And Dr. Achika, you want to say something?
No, let me finish. Let me finish.
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
So there is a interesting Singapore prediction. I don't know if many of you have seen this. This is from the Singapore University. It's probably the most optimistic prediction of the lot. Okay, it says the world scenario will change by the end of November 2020. India will have drastic reductions from the end of May, and the epidemic will probably end in India in August 2000 this year. Okay, let's hope it's true. Let's hope and pray it is true. I'm not a great prayer believer, but I think this is one time where we need to pray. Okay,
all of us need to pray actually.
Yeah, you want me to comment on that, Ashwini?
Yes, sir.
It's always risky for bedside clinicians to comment on public health issues like this. But my 2 cents.
But then we have so many questions coming in about this because everyone is worried about post-lockdown, what is going to be there, and everyone has anxiety about the same.
You know, I think ultimately we will have to develop herd immunity. Our big advantage is we are a young country. So most of our population is young. It will probably sweep across most of our population with minimal mortality. 0.65% was what the Lancet study said. So the people who will be in trouble are the elderly, which luckily is much less in our country compared to others, and those with comorbidities. So we need to move towards protecting them, so-called reverse quarantine, and gradually open up our economy so that we can develop herd immunity gradually, so that our healthcare systems are not swamped. That is what I feel. That's what every virus ultimately goes down only when you develop herd immunity.
Okay, so how do we go about post-lockdown strategy? How do we plan it? Sunita ma'am?
Ashwini, sorry to interfere. I think
we are running out of time.
12 minutes past 4. Yeah.
Okay. So this is the last question. Can we take because because this has been asked by almost 10-15 people. Yeah.
Post-lockdown strategy, just like what Dr. George and Dr. Ram had told earlier, we can't go on in a lockdown forever. We have to open it up. We will get herd immunity. And fortunately for us, mortality has not been that bad. Hopefully it's because of our protoplasm and the fact that we are younger population in the country. And it's important to do it in a gradual way so that less number of people are exposed at a time, and thereby less number of patients coming down into the hospital, and eventually release more and more people such that the herd immunity would develop. This is going to be a challenge not only in the healthcare system, but in the entire all other spectrums of life. So it will have to. We just have to open up the economy at some point in time, and we will have to face it. When we open it up, we will see more patients coming in, at least for some period of time before it settles down. And we have to, we hopefully have created systems in this network across the country to handle patients who come in once the lockdown is opened. That's more important, to prepare to take in the surge of patients that will come a few weeks after the lockdown is opened. So as long, be prepared.
Yeah, I guess this lockdown has given us enough time to prepare our system to face post-lockdown consequences. Dr. George, you want to add 1 or 2 sentences about this?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that if we want to remove the lockdown, we should probably do it in summer, not when it starts raining. Okay, it's important for whatever it's worth. So May is the time to release you from lockdown in a phased manner. The phased manner is probably 1 week at a time, but we can't take ages about phasing it. Okay. So in 2-3 phases, one has to basically unlock. Otherwise, the people will die of more people will die of hunger than COVID. That's probably already happening.
Okay. Yeah. I guess we'll have to stop here. Thank you, panelists, for a wonderful discussion. And I guess we have given justification to majority of the queries, whatever we had. And it was really a wonderful session. Even I have learned quite a bit of it. Thank you, Nambi, for giving us the opportunity of being here and solving queries for the people.
Thank Dr. Ashwini. Wish we could keep going on discussing. Unfortunately, we are bound by time. And I thank Dr. Neha, Dr. Sunita Nareddy, Dr. Ram Gopal Krishnan, and Dr. George K. Verghese for sparing their time and sharing their valued opinion. And I thank Ashwini a lot. Why? Because even you had updated your slides with the latest IDSA recommendation on infection control. So the Infectious Disease Society of America has come up with some guidelines regarding the treatment that came a week ago. But yesterday they had come up with the infection control aspects of that, with some key recommendations. Yeah. She had even prepared that and then added on. Thanks, Shuni. Thanks for doing it. And I think all good things should come to an end. So we had the first webinar series for 6 lectures. The second one, we are done with 4. And I do not know how to proceed further with respect to this COVID epidemic per se. Perhaps there will be a feedback form mailed to all the participants, both for the first series as well as the second series. Please feel free to put in your suggestions on how could we take it further down in terms of education. That is something that we are willing to hear from the audience, in what format or what could be the topics, something like that. That is something that we are looking at. And all these lectures are available in our website, sidsindia.org, www.sidsindia.org. And the lectures are available. So probably you'll have around 10 lectures or 10 sessions there. You can view in there. And SIDS website also has a section on COVID, in which I think I would refer all of you to go through the standalone clinic infection control. That would actually give a 2-page, 3-page ready reckoner kind of thing for all people having their outpatients, how to handle the infection control aspect there. And if you want to watch it in YouTube, all we have to do is type in SIDS webinar, and all you will have is access to all those 10 sessions unlimited. And I thank once again all the viewers for giving us the support and encouragement to continue to do so with some activities like this. And it has been our SIDS Society's own initiative. We haven't taken any kind of pharma support for this, even though we've had a lot of offers, so that we wanted the content to be undiluted without any kind of promotion in terms of pharma. And I think right now we will come to an end to this second series. And then probably we will try to meet you again. I'm not sure when. Probably we will come up with some kind of a different format, different version, and we will keep engaging all throughout. And once again, thank all the panelists and Dr. Ashwini for sparing the time. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Nambi.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Nambi.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye. Bye.